I'd like to welcome you all to yet another exciting webinar under the Career Guidance Series, United States Fellowship Track. For those of you who don't know what Alfaisal MedHub is, Alfaisal MedHub is an initiative under the umbrella of the International Office College of Medicine that aims at creating an online global community of medical students. Alfaisal MedHub covers a broad range of topics that are common to medical students all around the world. Our primary objective here at Alfaisal MedHub is to help medical students learn more about the career opportunities available after graduating, as well as the steps involved in pursuing them. After conducting a series of webinars on the various milestones of the application process of pursuing residency in the United States, we now hope to shed light on the various subspecialty fellowship pathways. Fellowship is the very next step of medical training after residency for many, and although there is considerable knowledge among students and prospective doctors about residency in the United States, the journey from being a resident to becoming a fellow and consultant remains relatively vague. Hence, CGS US Fellowship aims to gauge medical students, graduates, and residents on this pathway and provide a guide to successfully matching into different subspecialties, making the process smoother. This series will kick off with a webinar on the overview of fellowship training pathways in the US and will be followed by a series of fellowship subspecialty-oriented webinars, including cardiology, gastroenterology, hematology, oncology, nephrology, surgical specialties, etc. The webinars will be delivered by distinguished Alfaisal alumni who have successfully matched into their dream fellowship programs after residency. We are truly honored to have these renowned individuals who have embarked on an incredible journey throughout their careers on board with us to deliver these webinars. Please find scheduled webinars along with their dates and indicating their respective speaker's name. With no further delay, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Khalid Jazieh, our speaker for today, who will be delivering two webinars, beginning with an title overview of the fellowship pathway and application process, which will be followed by a fellowship subspecialty-oriented webinar titled Pursuing Hematology Oncology Fellowship Training in the U.S. Dr. Khalid Jazieh is a Hematology Oncology Fellow at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. He graduated from Alfaisal University as valedictorian in 2017. He went on to do an internal medicine residency at the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio, where he did a year as chief resident of quality and safety. He is interested in academic oncology, evidence-based medicine, and medical education. He is the founder and developer of the website Landmark Trials for Medical Trainees and has worked on several resources and educational initiatives for those interested in pursuing clinical training in the United States. Dr. Khalid will be providing an overview of the fellowship application process in the US and will then dive deep into discussing the application process and must-know of his specialty, hematology and oncology. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Khalid. We're looking forward to this exciting webinar. Before we start, I'd just like to make sure if you would like the questions towards the end, or if you would like to answer them as they come.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you for that very, very kind introduction. I think we can leave the questions to the end, inshallah. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here today. And thank you again, Anush and the International Office for arranging this and for allowing me to be a part of this. As Anush mentioned, this, we're going to have the first, part of this talk is going to be general advice, pursuing regarding pursuing fellowship, and then inshallah for the second part I'm going to focus on my fellowship, which is hematology oncology, and then there are going to be other speakers down the line who will inshallah talk about the fellowships that they're pursuing or that they're doing or have completed, because some of them have even completed fellowship. Inshallah, and I will promise you a few things in this talk. First of all, I will not take the full hour. Inshallah, I'm gonna spend a lot less than an hour speaking. That's the first promise. The second promise is that I hope that everything that I say will be useful and practical advice that you guys can use. And the third thing is I actually want to spend a lot of time answering questions. So hopefully, inshallah, ideally, it'll be more time with me answering your questions than me actually speaking. That's the goal, inshallah. And I know that for those of you who are across the ocean, it's probably later in the day than it is over here. So thank you for coming at such a late time to attend this. So let's go ahead and get started. See if this is moving. Okay, perfect. So the agenda for the first, hour is going to be, why do a fellowship? What fellowship options are available? How do you know what fellowship you want to pursue? How to improve your chances at matching in your fellowship of choice, and what to look for in a fellowship program. I'm not sure if we have a breakdown actually of the people attending. I recognize some of the names as names of residents, and some of them are medical students. But my understanding is this kind of invitation was open to all, and I know we have some medical students with us, and we have some people who are already in residency. So I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction to the concept of fellowship, just in case there are people who don't really understand what it is and where it lies in the career pathway. And then, of course, moving on to more advice for people who are coming up soon to fellowship kind of application and things like that. So, just a disclaimer: I'm in the internal medicine field, so I did residency in internal medicine, and I'm hematology oncology is a subspecialty of internal medicine. My talk is going to be focused on internal medicine subspecialty fellowships. There will be other folks who will be talking about pediatrics and general surgery, inshallah, and surgical fellowships and all that, and the other specialties. Of course, the other disclaimer is that these are my opinions. It's obviously good to get advice from other people as well, and to get a range of opinions. And there will be some people who may disagree with what I have to say. And, I think that's totally fine. My advice won't fit everybody. And some people may benefit from some of what I have to say. It may be beneficial to get advice, or it is definitely beneficial to get advice from other people as well. So going into this, inshallah, for those listening who have made it in, many of them have made it into residency, but inshallah, for those who haven't, in a few years, inshallah, you will all be residents. Now what? What do you do after you match into your residency program and you start your residency? Well, first of all, you can kind of relax, take it a little easy, take a deep breath. If you've made it into residency in the US, and this is, again, our talk is going to be focused on the United States, pathway, then you really achieved a big step in your career in medicine in the United States. It's extremely rare for someone who's made it into a residency program to then fail in their career moving forward in the US. Yes, there are some very competitive fellowships and things like that, and people may struggle to get where they want to go in terms of the next steps, but very few people will actually have a quote unquote failed career. There's a shortage of physicians. Wherever you go, you're going to find jobs. Your residency in and of itself will set you up for a career, even if you don't do a fellowship. So for those of you watching who have already made it into residency, then pat yourself on the back, take a deep breath, and alhamdulillah, you've probably completed the most important step for a career in medicine in the United States. Those of you who are not listening, then inshallah, obviously the emphasis, or sorry, those of you who are listening but have not made it into I hope you're all listening. Those of you who have not made it into residency yet, then obviously that should be your main focus and main emphasis. It's not a bad idea to hear about fellowship and hear a little bit more about what lies beyond residency, but getting into residency should be the primary goal. And the reason why, as Anush mentioned, there's not that much emphasis on advice for trainees on how to get into fellowship is once you've made it into residency, usually beyond that it's easier, especially for internal medicine graduates, international medicine graduates, IMGs. The hardest step is usually getting into residency. Once you do that, then usually getting into fellowship is inshallah going to be easier. And not only that, a lot of the process is going to be repetitive. So it's going to be the same steps as you did for residency. You'll see a lot of it will be repeated in fellowship. So you've already been through this once before. So that's why there really isn't that much, that many resources, so to speak, for fellowship application. And that's understandable because, it's not as challenging for most people, but I think it's still a great idea that we're actually having these conversations. Again, take it easy. If you make it this far, relax, try to explore some hobbies. Maybe if you can, residency is going to be a little bit of a difficult time. I personally got into fishing in residency, so you may see some fishing references here and there. But really, I think getting into residency takes the biggest burden off your shoulders. But again, don't relax too much, because you obviously have to start thinking about next steps and beyond what happens beyond residency. So the first question is, I think, why pursue a fellowship? And this may seem like a very basic and fundamental question, but I think a lot of us don't, coming from at least training in Saudi Arabia and seeing what how we think about residency and fellowship, I think a lot of people don't think about it correctly. And I see a lot of medical students, when we do like mock residency interviews and things like that, or talk about residency application, a lot of them will say, well, I'm going to do, when you ask them the question in the mock interview, what are your goals after residency? A lot of them will say, I want to do a fellowship. It's like, oh, okay, interesting. What fellowship do you want to do? They're like, oh, I don't know, any fellowship. It's like, that's interesting. Why are you so fixated on pursuing a fellowship? A lot of us think like it's a necessary step. A lot of medical students, I think, especially kind of in the background that I came from Alfaisal, think that it's a must. You have to do residency and you have to do fellowship. If you don't do fellowship, then you're kind of falling short on your career. And that's not actually true. The way I think of fellowship is, yes, it's a next step after residency, but really it's more of a target. You're trying to hit a target, a goal. And for some people, their goal does not necessarily require a fellowship. So, it's important to understand what your goal is in your career. And, doing a fellowship just for doing a fellowship isn't necessarily a good idea. What you have to understand, what is your preferred specialty? So if you really, you want to do cardiology, you loved cardiology in medical school, or, you loved pediatric gastroenterology, for example, or you loved, in general surgery, in your rotation, you got exposed to bariatric surgery, for example, and you really loved bariatric surgery, then obviously, at that point, you have a specialty that needs a fellowship to really master and to get into. In those situations, it definitely makes sense to do a fellowship. Now, someone might say, well, isn't it better to always do a fellowship because you'll get paid more and you'll technically have more training under your belt, so you get a higher quote unquote status or higher pay? That's actually not necessarily true. There are some fellowship options in some hospitals, or some subspecialty options in some hospitals, that may often pay less than a general, internist, for example, or like a primary care physician or a hospitalist. And speaking of that, for example, speaking now specifically about internal medicine, primary care, being a primary care physician, or being a hospitalist, meaning doing internal medicine in the hospital, taking care of primarily internal medicine services, these are attractive career options for many people, and they rarely require a fellowship. Some hospitals will offer you a fellowship in these, fields to just get a little more experience, maybe do a little more research. But most places you can actually work as a primary care doctor, or as an internist, or as a hospitalist, in the hospital, right after you're done with residency. So, and again, depending on where you work and in the hospital that you're working at, especially, for example, if it's a community practice, they tend to pay a little more. You can actually get paid more in these specialties, or in just, being a hospitalist or being a primary care physician, than you would, necessarily in some of the other subspecialties, especially if you're working in an academic hospital. Unfortunately, academic hospitals tend to pay less. So, it's not a absolutely necessary step in progressing in your career in medicine. Pursuing a fellowship is not a necessary step. It really depends on what your goal is. And I hear this a lot, especially when I'm doing mock interviews with people who are applying for residency. They'll say, oh, what do you want to do after residency? They're like, oh, I'll do a fellowship. It's like, well, what do you want? What fellowship? And they have no idea what fellowship they want to do. So doing a fellowship just for doing a fellowship is not really necessary, so to speak, and it should be a means to achieve a goal. And then moving on, well, what fellowship options are there? There are the usual ones that we hear about, and these are probably the ones that are the most common, and I think these are the ones that we will focus on in the series that we're doing. These are the ones you hear the most about. Cardiology, GI, and Hem/Onc are, I think, the top three kind of most competitive, most in demand. But then you have others like endocrinology, nephrology, rheumatology, pulmonary critical care, infectious disease, palliative medicine. Again, now I'm speaking predominantly about the internal medicine options. Pediatrics has a lot of these similar options, as well for pediatric, populations. Obviously, the surgical specialties, obstetrics and gynecology, they'll probably have different fellowship options. These options are often ACGME accredited, and this is the American Committee or Council for Graduate Medical Education. These are the ones that will put kind of the rules and the guidelines for residencies and fellowships, things like, duty hour violations, things like, curriculums that people need to establish and follow. They'll survey the trainees there. So this is important that if you're looking for one of these specialties, you want to make sure that it's ACGME accredited. And this usually follows the same ERAS and NRMP match process, just like for residency. So for those of you who've done residency, or for those of you who've watched our series on the residency application process, you'll recognize this. But then there are less common, areas of fellowship that are very kind of niche, very focused areas of interest. There are things, so some places will offer a hospital medicine fellowship. It's often very focused on like research for inpatient care or quality improvement or, education, as opposed to just simply how do you take care of patients in the hospital under internal medicine, because most 3-year residency programs in internal medicine will teach you how to be a very good hospitalist. If they don't, then that's a problem in the residency. You should feel very comfortable being a primary care doctor or being a hospitalist when you're done with your residency program. But there are some areas that will offer a fellowship for this extra stuff, kind of research or QI or education in hospital medicine. Clinical informatics, which is very data driven and research and things like that. Those are I see some people do fellowships in that. Obesity medicine, for example. These niche areas are less likely to be ACGME accredited. They're often outside the match. Not always. Some of them may be still inside the match. Some of them may still be ACGME accredited. But just keep in mind that there are these options that are not kind of the standard fellowship options that some people actually do find interesting, and people apply for them kind of like they would for a regular job. They send their CV, they email the folks, they tell them they're interested. They usually do an interview, and if they like them, they'll send them the offer for the fellowship. So just kind of keeping a bit of an open mind about this is, I think, useful and beneficial. This is the typical timeline for an internal medicine kind of track, and I think is also probably similar for other specialties as well. You start off as a medical student, which some of you, I think, on this call are. You go on to be a resident, which, again, some of you on the call are. And then you have the option, if you want to pursue a specific subspecialty, to do a fellowship, and then to become a staff or a consultant, depending on where you are, what they're called. Some places or some career options also have an advanced fellowship, and I'll touch base briefly about advanced fellowships. But for example, you can do internal medicine residency. You can do, a cardiology fellowship, for example. Now, if you want to subspecialize even more within cardiology, there are often further advanced fellowships that you can do. So you can do, for example, electrophysiology. These are the people who focus on cardiac arrhythmias, AFib, A-flutter, things like that. You can do interventional cardiology. These are the people who are there kind of doing the catheterizations and the valve procedures and things like that. So that is an additional year or 2 years or other how many years of training after fellowship as an advanced fellow for someone who really wants to subspecialize within their subspecialty. And then they become a staff or a consultant. Again, if you want to be a primary care physician, for example, in internal medicine, you can go straight from residency to being a primary care provider. You don't have to be, you don't have to go through fellowship or advanced fellowship. For many places, you don't even have to do an advanced fellowship. You can do a GI fellowship, for example, and then go straight to becoming a GI consultant. An important point about this when you're thinking about this timeline is obviously you want it to be something that you are willing to dedicate this much time to training for, but you also have to keep in mind, pay, if we're going to be factual and realistic, payment is important, and recognize that until you're a staff or a consultant, you're really not making those, you're not getting that big paycheck and that heavy salary that is often associated with physicians. Even as an advanced fellow, you're still a trainee. You'll be getting a salary as a resident or a fellow or an advanced fellow, but it's not the biggest salary, and you can probably save a little bit of money on it, but really it's you're probably going to be renting an apartment and leasing a car and things like that during this time. So just something to keep in mind, the time, and also understanding that, these options of fellowship and advanced fellowship, they're not going to be paying nearly as much, as a staff position. And that often changes people's minds about, how they want to proceed with their careers. So I get this question quite a bit from people who are, in residency, or even medical students, is like, they see all these options and they really they find it all interesting in medical school. GI is interesting, cardiology is interesting, what do they pursue? And it comes down to, first of all, ideally something that interests you. You want to be interested by the pathology, by the physiology, by the what the job entails, but also keep in mind what you dislike. So for me, for example, I really hated scrubbing in and sterile procedures and masking up. And then I had to mask for 3 years, unfortunately. But that was a big deterrent for me. I don't like procedures as much. I'm not a very procedural person. So I knew kind of early on, and even in med school, but in residency as well, I confirmed it, that I don't want to do a heavy, procedural scrubbing in, scrubbing out, things like that, a specialty. I really liked, being in clinic. I love talking to patients. I love, helping patients walk through difficult situations. So that kind of really helped me select a few choices and also eliminate other choices. And that becomes important. You can kind of start checking things off and then kind of circling things that you like. What lifestyle are you looking for? That's also important. Some specialties are more intense, have a more intense and demanding lifestyle. Some specialties will demand or will expect you to work nights. Crit care, for example, if you're in the ICU, you will be expected to work night shifts. Cardiology you'll often be on call and have to come in, for night calls and night shifts. It's true, you may be able to negotiate contracts and things like that, and kind of, change or increase or decrease some of the things you do, but you have to keep in mind that there's a lot of expectations that are often very difficult to negotiate. I can't imagine, a Palm Crit fellow right after fellowship negotiating with a hospital saying they don't want to do any night shifts whatsoever. I don't think that's going to go well. So you have to understand, what the lifestyle of that specialty is going to look like. And then pay is also something that, you have to keep in mind. I think it's no secret to people that the procedural specialties like cardiology and GI tend to make a good amount of money. Hematology, oncology makes money as well because of the chemotherapy. So those specialties tend to be very well paid. The unfortunate reality is, some of our colleagues, like in infectious disease, for example, even though I find it very interesting and the work is very valuable to us in the hospital, they're not paid as highly as some of the other specialties. So that's, I think, important to keep in mind when you're looking at these specialties. And again, to that point, look at what is the demand. So you want to find a specialty or a career that is in demand and that people are going to be looking for you and willing to pay higher for you and willing to negotiate a contract with you. And it's very, very important to learn what the specialty will be like after the training, after the fellowship. Talk to consultants or staff physicians. Talk to cardiologists and tell them what is it like to be a cardiologist, especially someone who's maybe fresh out of fellowship. What's the lifestyle like? What are things that caught you by surprise? If you could go back again and do it again, would you do it again? There are surveys actually, that you can find online about these specialties, and you'll be surprised about the number of people who would actually not choose their specialty again, if they had a chance to do medicine all over again. So I think these are important things to keep in mind when trying to identify the fellowship or the specialty that you want to kind of dedicate yourself to. Now, when should you decide is another question, that I get asked. I think, a lot of people feel like they need to know before residency. The earlier you know, the better, but it's okay if you don't know by the time you start residency what you want to do. I think the end of the first year of residency, maybe the beginning of second year, is probably the best time for you is probably the latest that you want if you want to apply for fellowship right after residency. And what do I mean by that? So if we go back to the timeline, let me go back here to the timeline. So most residencies, like internal medicine, for example, is a 3-year residency program. Usually in the final year of your residency, you're going to be applying for fellowship. So towards the beginning of your 3rd year, you'll be applying for fellowship. So you only have kind of 2 years of residency to figure out what you want to do and start preparing your CV. to prepare for your application. Now, this is the typical timeline. Some people may not follow the typical timeline, and I'll talk about that briefly. But really, by your second year of residency, you want to have your specialty identified and your specialty of interest identified, and you want to be working towards it. If you're going to apply by the beginning of third year residency, it would be good to have some publications, for example. It would be good to have mentors by then. You should have letters of recommendation by the beginning of your third year of residency, because that's when you're going to be applying, typically, if you follow the typical timeline. Again, just even if you haven't figured something out, it's not like you should lose hope. Like I said, if you've made it into residency, then inshallah you're going to have a career in medicine in the United States. There are people who kind of go through different tracks and they don't follow the typical timeline. There are people, for example, who come in knowing for a fact they want one specialty, they'll do research in it, they'll publish in it, and then by the end of their second year, they do a rotation and they absolutely love the other specialty. And throughout the first kind of 2 years of residency, they're starting to dislike their initial specialty. They're not as fond of it. Then they do a rotation or two rotations in another specialty and they love it. And they kind of decide midway in residency, oops, I want to change my fellowship interest. Again, that's still very doable. It's it's not a hopeless situation. I've seen people match in incredible places doing this. I think it's very important to be honest about what you want to commit to, because again, this is going to be hopefully for the rest of your life. And people, there's several ways of doing it. You can, even if you have done research in another specialty, and we'll talk about this in a bit, even if you've done research in another specialty, the skills that you get from that can still translate over to the other fellowship that you're going to pursue, right? It's more about the research skills and the dedication to scholarship and the dedication to publication that people like. There are ways that you can kind of take a less traditional route. Some people will work as a hospitalist for a year or two after residency. They'll continue to accumulate research in that area of interest. They'll continue to, work with mentors, even as a hospitalist, and they're technically a staff physician. They're getting paid, the 6-digit salary, and they're getting paid, the big bucks as a consultant. They'll still work, for example, with a cardiologist or a hematologist mentor, continue to do research like they were in residency, and then apply after a year or two of working as a hospitalist. For example, many oncology centers, many cancer centers now will have dedicated hospitalists for their cancer patients inpatient. So I know several people who will work as a hospitalist in cancer centers. They'll take care of the patients. They'll get a great salary. They're working as a staff physician, but they'll use that time to connect with mentors in that cancer center, to work on research in that cancer center, and then they'll apply for fellowship. After having worked for a hospitalist, as a hospitalist for a year or two. To be honest, some people choose this route, and then when they start making the good money as a hospitalist, they decide, you know what, I'm not going to go back and get a pay cut as a fellow. I'm just going to continue with this. I prefer to do this than be a trainee again for another 3 years. So just a warning for people who may be considering that. But it's still a very viable option. You don't necessarily have to jump straight from residency into fellowship. Now, with regards to the application process, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this. It's very similar to residency. For those of you who haven't gotten into residency yet, obviously, I would recommend you go to our videos on the residency application process. Alfaisal MedHub on YouTube has a lot of great videos about this on the career guidance series. But it's the same thing. You're going to use the ERAS portal right here. You're going to put your CV there, your personal statement. You have to write another personal statement. It's my least favorite part of the entire application process. I hate personal statements, but you have to write one. You'll need, letters of recommendation. You'll get one from your program, from your residency program. So you want one from your program director. You'll apply to the programs through ERAS. You'll have less programs, and we'll talk a little bit about this, but you're going to be more selective when you're applying for fellowship than when you are applying for residency. I think as international graduates, we tend to cast a very wide net and apply to a lot of programs for residency. For fellowship, you can tend to be a little more selective unless it's one of the extremely competitive ones. And then you'll probably have to, again, broaden your application, the number of programs you apply to. You'll interview at programs. This year, the past few years, they've been virtual. I don't know how long they'll continue that for. I think a lot of people tend to prefer the virtual option now. It saves a lot on costs for both the programs and the applicants. And then you'll rank the programs via the NRMP website, the match. So again, like I said, I'm not gonna kind of take up your time discussing this now. We've got a lot of videos already out on this, and for those of you who are already residents, you all are very familiar with this process. So the more important thing is, well, how do you maximize your chances, as a resident of getting into the fellowship of choice? And there's really a lot of tools in your toolbox, so to speak, that you can use to maximize your chances. Point 1, point 2, and point 3 are all the same. Be an excellent resident. This is the most important thing. This is the most valuable thing. If you are a sloppy resident, if you don't take good care of your patients, if you are not a good team player, if your staff or fellows can't depend on you, I mean, it's going to be very hard for someone to write you an honest, good letter of recommendation recommending you to people. If you are, phenomenal, you're on top of your tasks, people love working with you, people enjoy spending time with you, your patients really like you and they speak highly of you, this is really going to cover like 80% of what you need to get where you want to go. But of course, there are many excellent residents, and that's true. I've worked with, I've been in, resident in one hospital, now a fellow in another hospital, and I've just worked with a lot of phenomenal residents that I'm sure are all getting very strong letters of recommendation. So you want to stand out in the other kind of, the smaller things is where the difference comes about. You want mentors. You want several mentors in the field. I'd say 2 mentors. If you have one really good mentor, they can carry you a long way. But it's not a bad idea to have another mentor as well. These are people who you can talk to about your interests, people who you can ask them questions about the specialty. And then, of course, ideally, if they have, research opportunities, if you're working at a place, at an academic center that has research, to support you to doing research, it would be very important and very useful. So you want mentors in the field, you need mentors in the field. And oftentimes these are going to be the folks who will write you strong letters of recommendation. And again, doing research and publishing and presenting is a very good way to demonstrate you kind of your commitment to research and your commitment to kind of working on these things and publishing. This is, there are people who clearly know they do not want to do research and they are not interested in kind of academic medicine. I think it's still, first of all, I think it's still useful as a resident to work on these things. You cannot really rule something out completely until you try it. So I think it's very important to try it in research, to try doing research and dabbling in research if you can in residency. It'll get you skill sets that may be useful down the line. It'll kind of introduce you to the world of research. It'll help broaden your chances of the options that you can get into for fellowship. A lot of the academic places that offer some of the best fellowship training have an expectation that you will do research. Most residency programs will expect you to do some form of research and kind of present it or publish it or something like that. So do it in the field of specialty you're interested in. Now, again, if you're in a smaller hospital, it's not a very academic place, you don't have a lot of research opportunities, this can be a little more difficult for people. Again, there are people who can get into fellowship even without research, and there are programs that understand that not everybody's coming from an academic background and not everybody's interested in academics. But if you can, I think, increase your exposure to the specialty, particularly at academic places. A lot of the smaller kind of community hospitals will have affiliations with bigger academic university hospitals. Try to do a rotation there if you can, 2 or 3 rotations. You can meet mentors there. You can maybe get hooked on a project or 2 there. And this is gonna really help you strengthen your CV, increase your exposure to the specialty and see what it's like, and also get more mentors and support when you apply for the fellowship. I do get questions from people who are, again, in smaller hospitals that are doing residency in smaller hospitals and don't have the resources. And I understand it can be difficult, but this is one of the ways to work around it, is to kind of do like an away rotation at a bigger center that does have those options and those resources available to you. Now, more advanced tools and kind of extra options that people kind of use when they're improving their resume, their CV, and strengthening their application, and trying to strengthen their chances or increase their chances of matching at the fellowship of interest. Asking for mentor and PD program director support during the application process. I know people who would ask their mentors to call up their program of choice, their number one program, and tell them, hey, I mentored this resident, they were excellent. They're telling me you are their number one program, and they really want to match, in your program. And I just wanted to pass that along, and I think they're excellent, and I'm happy to answer any questions about them. Same thing, the program director will, sometimes do that. Especially I hear in smaller programs, they do that quite a bit. The program director, they really like the residents, they'll call maybe one or two programs for them and tell them, tell the fellowship program director, hey, this applicant, he's a resident in our program, or she's a resident in our program, and they're excellent. I get asked this quite a bit. Is doing a chief year good for fellowship application? I think that a chief year is generally a pretty good, strong addition to a person's CV. I did a chief year, and I can tell you, when I applied for fellowship, a lot of the program directors were very interested in my chief year experience. A lot of program directors now, especially kind of the younger generation of program directors for fellowships, come from a medical education background, a med ed background, meaning they're dedicated to medical education. They're not necessarily the most senior person in the department. In fact, most of them were not that senior in the department, but what they had was a med ed background. And med ed is kind of becoming its own specialty within medicine, where people will do medical education research. They'll take courses on medical education and adult learning and things like that. So they become focused on medical education. And you have to know that when you say you're interested in medical education, if you say interested in medical education, that doesn't mean you like teaching. That means it means more than that. Most of us tend to like teaching to some degree. If you say you're interested in medical education, it means like you're interested in a career and research involved in teaching. You may be interested in a program director position and things like that. So a lot of them come from that background now. So they get interested in like the chief year and the chief experience, and what was it like to teach residents, and how did you deal with residents that had difficulty or that had challenges. So I got these questions quite a bit about my chief year. Now, a couple of points that I'll make about the chief year. I would not recommend that you do the chief year just to strengthen your CV or your application. That's not a good idea for a couple of reasons. Number one, it is a busy year. It tends to be busy. You will be doing a lot of administrative work. You'll be doing a lot of scheduling work. You will be taking care of a lot of drama going on. You'll be putting out fires left and right. People will come to you with problems. There will be people, who don't show up to clinic one day, and you have to put that fire out. I love the year. I love the teaching. I enjoyed actually the administrative side of things. I enjoyed seeing how things were done behind the scenes. I didn't like the scheduling that much, but I would recommend doing it only if you're interested in that aspect of chief year, and recognize that it will boost your kind of application. And it's really kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity, because once you're done with residency, you can't go back and be a chief resident. But don't do it just for the sake of strengthening your application for fellowship application. Again, it's a difficult year, and you may regret it if you just do it for that reason. If you need more time to do more research and things like that, again, like I said, there are other options. You can work as a hospitalist or a primary care doctor or something like that, and get paid a whole lot more than a chief resident would. But it's the short answer is yes, I think it does help, and does look good on the CV. But the longer answer is that shouldn't be the only reason why you pick it, and you should really want to be interested in the other aspects of it to enjoy it. And then, like I said, I really love my year as chief resident, so I'd encourage you guys to consider it. And again, like I said, you can work as a hospitalist, or a primary care doc. I'm sure pediatrics has options. You may be able to work as a general pediatrician or a general surgeon, but I'll let kind of the people from those backgrounds talk about that a little more. I've seen people do some very advanced stuff. I've seen someone do a master's in their residency, which was extremely difficult, and I don't know, they probably didn't sleep much at all during their residency. It's not something that I would recommend because it's extremely difficult to do. But some people do this. Some people pursue an extra degree, maybe a master's during residency. Again, some people will take work as as an internist for a year or two and pursue that on the side while they're working, in order to kind of boost their application and boost their skill sets. And about that, there are other ways of boosting your skill sets beyond just pursuing a degree. You can take courses on how to maximize your statistical skills, learn how to use some of the programs like R, for example, to do statistics and things like that. You can you can learn these skills and be useful and demonstrate your use in these skills, for example, by using them in a paper, and show that you can bring that to fellowship without actually having to do the degree. But again, there are people who have done this, and I'm sure it helps. Now, on the other aspect, on the other end of the spectrum, is you want to look for you want to be selective, and you want to know what to look for in the program yourself. Again, like I said, when we're applying for residency, we cast a really wide net. But again, when it comes to fellowship, you can be a lot more selective, and people apply to like 250 programs for residency. I don't even think there are 250 fellowship programs. But things that you want to look for, most important thing is, where do the graduates of the fellowship go after their fellowship? You want to make sure that they get set up to go to really good places. If you're interested in academic career, research career, look at where they go. If you're interested in community practice, look at where they go. If you want to do advanced fellowships, look and see if the program has an advanced fellowship that you can take. Again, you want to make sure they have hands-on training, and that the fellows have autonomy, especially if this is a procedural specialty, cardiology, GI, things like that. You want to make sure you get a lot of hands-on training. You're not going to have supervision you're not going to have nearly as much supervision when you're a staff or a consultant. You're going to be the one kind of running the cases yourself. So you want to make sure that you get that training as a fellow. Look for research and teaching opportunities, especially if you're interested in academics. Make sure that their fellows are publishing or putting out research output. You want to make sure that the institute is kind of welcoming, warm, collegial, friendly, and look at the location. And the last two I've included here are very important because people tend to stay. I don't know what the percentage is, but I notice a large trend of people staying in their institute, or at least staying in the same city after their fellowship. So you want to make sure this is an institute. Is this an institute that you would like to work at after you're done with fellowship? Because this is not just fellowship, you also look at it as a potential future job. And the same thing for the city. And then, of course, for international graduates, visa considerations, the H-1B visa, the J-1 visas, you have to look into that and make sure that they can sponsor the visa that you're interested in. And that becomes very important for international medical graduates. And inshallah, with this advice, I'll help you guys get the knowledge and skills you want to land the perfect program and catch the perfect program that suits you best. And inshallah, you'll all end up doing really well in residency and getting into excellent fellowships and having excellent careers beyond that. Oh, I actually took much longer than I thought I would. My apologies about that. I'll open this now to answer questions, and that's my email if you guys have questions you wanna send to me more privately.
Hey, Khalid Jazieh. It's Khalid as well.
Hey,
I'm one of the
Khalid.
residents at UCSF Fresno PGY1. Thank you for the amazing talk. It was really nice. Especially I'm personally interested in cardiology, but also a lot of the tips, the general advice was also much appreciated. I do have some questions, mainly three. I'll give them to you one by one, and then we'll go from there pretty much.
Sure.
One is most of the time we don't have, we might not have a choice, but for those who do you think spending a year as a hospitalist worsens someone's chance compared to an applicant either right out of residency or right out of a chief year? I kind of heard mixed feelings about this one. I just wanted to see your opinion about it.
I think it depends. It has to be very individual basis and also program basis. Here's the thing. People tend to form, I'll answer broadly and then more specifically. People tend to form kind of their own opinions and biases. So for example, what I mean is if a program takes one or two people who are hospitalists before their fellowship and struggles with those people, for example, they're very difficult to come in for night shifts, or they tend to be a little arrogant because they have some baseline clinical experience working. then automatically that program is going to, so whether consciously or subconsciously, they're just going to form a negative impression. On the other hand, if another program gets 2 or 3 people who worked as hospitalists before coming into fellowship and they did a phenomenal job and they were excellent clinically and they felt like those people were a little more solid than the people who came straight out of residency, then that might kind of incline them to be more fond of that. So number one, there's a lot that you can't control in that issue, is the prior experiences of the people there. But also on an individual level, and what you can control is it really depends on what you think your strength is as an applicant when you start your 3rd year of residency. Do you think that you as an applicant, you've got some research to show for your, the work that you've done, you've got mentors who really like you and are willing to write you a strong letter of recommendation? If you have research, you think you've done really good in your residency program, your evaluations in your residency are excellent, you think your program director, you're confident your program director is going to write you a strong letter of recommendation, you've got like maybe a poster presentation or 2 or 3 publications, how much more strength or benefit are you going to get having worked as a hospitalist? I'm not really sure, that how beneficial that's going to be for you. And again, the whole point of you being, of you doing residency is that you should be a competent internist by the time you're done with residency. So yes, you may get more skill, obviously more experience when you work a year or 2 as a hospitalist. But again, they're not necessarily looking for that higher level of internal medicine practice and skill. I think if you feel like you are a strong candidate come 3rd year of residency, just go for it. And if you don't like the options that you have available for you when you're interviewing and ranking, maybe you can pull out from the rank and then work on more research and do a hospitalist year or 2. But if you come to the point of 3rd year where you're like, I don't have any research, the place I'm working at doesn't have good mentorship, I want to go and work at, for example, a hospitalist at a in a cardiology department. And I'm going to work with them in this big academic center for a couple of years. I'll do research there. I'll get to know them. They'll get to know me. That's always an option. It really depends on what your situation is like, I think, when the time for fellowship application comes.
Yeah, no, it's a very fair answer. Thank you. The other kind of questions I had, the second one is, a lot of people like to now, especially the ones that are not coming from like super academic programs. I heard this like buzz about the NIS database and using like your own like statistical software to generate research. Some people are doing kind of just a strict research year, like at an academic institution where they just do the NIS and pump out articles. Do you think that is kind of an adequate year to do after, for example, residency, if you want to buff up your application? Like, how does that factor into everything?
There were people who did like a research year at Cleveland Clinic where I did residency in the oncology department in particular. And my understanding is that research year seemed to really kind of help them broaden their fellowship application options because or they got more interviews, and they told me that the reason they got the interviews was a lot of people were very interested in the research year. So again, if you don't have any or much research, and you can do it at a kind of big academic center, you'll meet people, especially if you can do it in the area of your interest. I'm not sure if doing it general is general research, not related to the area of interest, for example, cardiology, if you're interested in cardiology. I'm not sure if that's necessarily as good of an idea, unless you have like zero research whatsoever and you want to demonstrate that you are committed to research and you've developed research skills and things like that, then perhaps in that situation. But because again, keep in mind, when you do that research year, you're going to be applying 2 months into your research year. So when you're interviewing in like in September, you've only been there for 3 months, so you won't even have anything to show for that year yet. So that's just the one thing I'll caution you about.
That's true. That's fair. And I didn't take into account the 2 months that you mentioned as well. That's a very fair piece of point. My last question is kind of just, it's a little out of the scope, but I also would appreciate your input. Essentially just approaching interview questions, because since the fellowships are a lot more tightly knit and there's a lot less fellows per cycle, sometimes they tend to ask about things that could affect the fellow's performance. What's your approach to answering questions that are about marriage or kids?
as far as I know, those are not legal questions to be asked in a fellowship interview. Although you will probably get asked them, because I got asked questions like that, and even in residency. I don't know. My suggestions, you know, just is to be honest, or be frank with them. If you know, if you're married, and then a lot of times they ask in terms of trying to be helpful. So for example, a lot of places, my institute now, for example, will offer a spouse job search program. Now, nobody asked me when I was interviewed if I was married, but I actually brought that up, and they you know, they came to kind of answer that question, and they answered that, you know, specifically, you know, with regards to helping search for a job, for example, for the spouse. So so some places may kind of bring it up in terms of trying to help, or trying to be, you know, like, oh, we've got great places for kids to study here, great schools, and you know, we help, you know, you'll help your wife find a job, for example. Usually most people are not going to be malignant about it. And again, keep in mind, many fellows in my fellowship program have kids now. Like, it's, you know, these, you know, it's not like, it's different from residency, right? There's more of an adult feeling about it. Unfortunately, I feel like people baby residents a little too much, but that's a whole other topic. But again, you know, there's more of an adult perspective. They're not going to hold your hand as much, but they're going to talk to you more like a colleague, and that's something that I have noticed a difference for, you know. And so they'll be talking about like these things kind of from like an adult to adult perspective of like, you know, hey, if you're interested in good schools for kids, we've got, you know, really good schools here, and things like that. And like I said, more people tend to stay, I feel like, where they did fellowship than where they did residency. So I think, you know, that's, and again, if you're getting uncomfortable vibes from the place, then that's important to keep in mind. Sorry, I don't know if I answered your question. I feel like I circled it, and I'm not sure if I answered it.
It's a good answer. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you
Yeah.
again for the talk.
Yeah, of course, my pleasure. Mohammed, before I answer, Mohammed Badib, there's a question in the chat. I'm a resident in Canada. I just want to ask, is step 3 mandatory for a fellowship in the US? Sorry, Hisham, I do not know. I am not sure. I have a feeling it might be, yes, because you will need a medical license. I applied for a medical license here in the state of Minnesota before I started fellowship. They asked me to apply for a medical license. So, but if you're coming from Canada, I'm not sure if that's necessary, if they'll let you work without like an internal medicine license. But I doubt it. I have a feeling, I can't say I'm 100% certain, but I have a feeling it is necessary. But I think you should look that up. Sorry, I don't know that off the top of my head. But I can tell you for a fact that I needed to apply for a license here in Minnesota to do fellowship here, and that you need the step 3 for that. Hamad Badib had his hand raised.
Yes, hello, Doctor. It's
Hello.
nice seeing you again.
Yep.
So I'm actually incoming BGY1, and like I have in my residency program in-house fellowship. So my question is actually if it would be like the optimal thing for any resident if he is interested in this, let's say a competitive fellowship, to focus into in-house fellowship or the fellowship that's present in the program, and what are the things that can be done to increase the chances there, especially like when they carry a small spot, like they all sorry, they only take one resident per year from the same group.
Yeah. That's a good question. I didn't talk about in-house fellowships and out-of-house fellowships. So an in-house fellowship is basically you stay in the same hospital for fellowship after residency, and it's usually people that you know well and you've worked with well because you've worked with them in your residency. Really, it depends on where you're at. If you're at a strong academic place that has, you know, great opportunities, you see the fellows going to great places after, you know, the fellowship. They've got good mentorship, and again, you have the advantage of talking very honestly to these people, to the fellows, and the fellows, you know, I've when I was in residency, I asked fellows, and even when I was applying for fellowship, most people were pretty honest about the pros and the cons. Again, there's a little more of an adult feeling about fellowship that I kind of didn't get with residency. But you'll have to take the fellows and ask them honestly, like what's mentorship like here? What's the experience like here? Would you do it again here? That's really one of that and where the fellows go and what the research opportunities are. That's one of the best ways for you to assess your fellowship program in-house. If you are struggling and nobody's mentoring you, and the fellows are not even getting mentors, and the fellows are just itching to get out of the hospital. Most of them are leaving the hospital when they're done. That's probably not a good sign. If all of the fellows tell you, listen, excellent opportunities, most fellows are competing to stay after fellowship, then that's a really good sign. Some of them will be honest and tell you, listen, I love the place, I love the culture. We don't have that much research opportunities, but everybody here is like a big team. They care for one another. Maybe you can get more research opportunities somewhere else, but I'm not interested in research and I like it here and I want to stay here for a job. Again, at that point, it kind of comes down to what your priorities are. Maximizing your chances, be a good resident. That's you. I mean, they will know you much better than other places will. And people talk behind. I can tell you as a chief resident, everybody knows who are the good residents, and everybody knows who are the residents that are So in your hospital, they'll know much better than out of hospital. So making sure that you're good with everybody. And again, these people, they're friends, especially if they did residency together. The cardiologist will know the gastroenterologist, will know the pulm crit doc. They'll have lunch together. They'll word will spread. They can probably access your internal evaluations. So yeah, just be a really good resident and try to find mentors in the program that will support you when you apply.
Thank you. I just have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So, for example, what I appreciate from some of the hospitals who have been working to finish their residency, they work for the hospital. Some of them was actually for the J1 waiver.
Yeah.
I am in different visa, which is H1B visa, so I will not necessarily need the waiver. So would it be like, for example, sometimes the hospital is years considered as that you are not that interested into the field? You got me?
Not necessarily, no. Not necessarily, no. Again, especially if you're honest, they might ask you. And again, like I said, these people, they can be pretty straightforward. And you can be pretty straightforward and say, I had a visa issue. And again, especially program directors, most of them are very aware about the visa complications and the visa concerns. And if you've done the waiver and things like that, then if you've gotten that out of the way, that might actually be a more positive thing, or a reassuring thing. I'm not necessarily saying you have to choose to do that, but most of them are very aware of the visa concerns. And especially if you're showing interest in terms of research and things like that, you're still active in research. Or sometimes if you, as a hospitalist, you're choosing to work in the department, if you can, like a hospitalist with the cardiology department or a hospitalist with the GI department or whatever, if that is an option available, and they kind of see you kind of rubbing with them and things like that, then again, that'll work in your favor.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
It's not necessarily a bad sign. Yeah.
Thank you.
I would just like to thank you so much for the informative presentation. We truly value your guidance and advice. I'm sure everyone in the audience found it just as beneficial. To everyone in the audience, thank you for joining us for this webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.